What if the most guarded secret in the royal family wasn't about who was there when Queen Elizabeth II died, but who wasn't allowed to be? Let that question settle for a moment. Because behind the black veils, the stoic faces, and the official statements that flooded the world on September 8, 2022, something else was unraveling. Something deeply personal and painfully political. A decision was made that day, not just about who would ascend the throne, but about who was shut out. About who was denied a final goodbye. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. The image was global. The Queen had passed. The palace gates were closed. Balmoral, her beloved Scottish sanctuary, was now a fortress of grief and royal transition. But behind those stone walls, a message had already been sent. Meghan Markle is not to come. Think about that. In the Queen's final hours. When time slows and legacies are sealed, King Charles allegedly issued a direct order that would change everything. One that would split the royal family not just across generations, but across oceans. William was reportedly torn. Harry was isolated. And Meghan? She was shut out. Now ask yourself, why? Why would the king, barely moments away from becoming sovereign, risk an even deeper family fracture during the most fragile transition in modern royal history? Was it vengeance? Fear? Or was it something the Queen herself wanted? Because here's where things get truly chilling. Some insiders claim that the Queen, even in her final hours, was lucid enough to speak, to choose her company, to send quiet signals, and most shockingly of all, to protect the future of the crown, not the emotions of her grandson's wife. What if her last wish wasn't reconciliation, but preservation? What if the Queen didn't want her deathbed turned into a battleground for scandal? What if her final words were meant to be about duty? And if that's true, if that really was her will, then King Charles's controversial decision might not have been a power move, but a sacred promise. A promise to the woman whose shadow he now stands in. Let's rewind. The public saw the headlines. The Queen is under medical supervision. The BBC cut to a black suit. The flags were lowered. And suddenly, the world mourned. But in that narrow window, between the Queen's deterioration and the official confirmation of her death, something frantic happened. Private jets scrambled. Senior royals were summoned. But not everyone was invited. Meghan Markle was told, point blank, to stay away, to not travel with Harry, to not come to Balmoral, even as the Queen lay dying. The palace would later call it a logistical decision. They'd say there wasn't time or space. But seasoned observers smelled something else. The language was vague. The timelines were fuzzy, and the silence from King Charles and Prince William? Deafening. In the hours after her death, royal insiders began to whisper that the Queen had made her wishes known, that she wanted a quiet passing, surrounded by loyalty, that certain names should be kept at a distance. And Meghan? She was one of them. Now here's where the story gets even murkier. According to multiple leaked accounts, and we'll get into the details later, William, not Charles, was the first to voice concern about Meghan's presence. It wasn't about race, or protocol, or even past headlines. It was about the moment. The Queen's final breath wasn't supposed to be about drama, tabloid scandals, or Netflix contracts. It was supposed to be about the crown, about legacy, about the sacred chain of monarchy that began long before Meghan and would endure long after her. William, sources say, believed Meghan's presence would pull focus, that she might say the wrong thing, or worse, leak the right thing. But the clincher? Some claim the Queen agreed, not in loud commands, not in an official order, but in a nod, a whispered sentence, a final glance at Charles. And that's when the door was metaphorically and physically shut. To the world, the Queen died peacefully, surrounded by family. But the unspoken truth is that not all family members were deemed worthy of that circle. And if you believe certain royal aides, this wasn't just about excluding Meghan. It was about defending the monarchy in its most vulnerable hour. Still, questions burn. Was Harry told in time? Did he fight for her to come? Did Meghan write a message? And more chillingly, did the Queen ever ask for her? Let's not forget, this wasn't just any moment. This was the moment. The Queen's death was the most significant royal event in a generation. Every detail would be picked apart for decades. Who was in the room? What was said? What wasn't? And what did it all mean? The royal family, especially King Charles, knew the stakes. They understood that the first hours of a new reign define everything. One false step, one misstep of protocol, and the monarchy's image could shatter. So when it came to the Queen's deathbed, they didn't just guard it like a family vigil. They guarded it like a state secret, which raises an uncomfortable possibility. Was Meghan banned not because of who she is, but because of what she represents? The Americanization of the monarchy, the Netflix documentary, the tell-all interviews, the break from tradition. Was this Charles's first act as king? To protect the sanctity of monarchy from a woman he feared would undermine it? And if so, was William complicit? You'll soon hear the account of a royal aide who claims William personally told Charles, "She can't be here. Not today. Not now. Not for this." You'll hear from a former palace official who alleges the Queen left behind a note, never made public, with instructions about who should be allowed in her final hours. You'll also discover why Harry has never publicly addressed the real reason Meghan stayed behind in London, even as his grandmother died alone. And finally, most explosively, you'll learn what William himself reportedly said, nearly a year later, in a private conversation that shocked his inner circle. It was the hardest decision we ever made, but she would have wanted it that way. Those words might be the key to everything. Because if the Queen's final moments were choreographed to preserve dignity, then Meghan's exclusion wasn't personal. It was constitutional. Let that sink in. Now, before we dive into the heart of this story, let's remember something about Queen Elizabeth II. She wasn't just a grandmother. She was a ruler, a tactician, a woman who understood that symbolism is everything. And if that meant denying herself the comfort of family in her last breath to safeguard the legacy of the monarchy, then perhaps she made that choice freely. Perhaps that was her will. But what if someone overrode her? What if Charles acted on his own? Or worse, what if the Queen did ask to see Meghan and was denied? You see, we're not just here to speculate. We're here to uncover, to dig into timelines, to decode palace statements, to read between the lines of silence. Because the truth doesn't always come in press releases. Sometimes, it comes in what's not said. So over the next several chapters, we'll peel back every layer of this moment. From the Queen's final days at Balmoral, to the tension in the corridors of Buckingham Palace, to the quiet fury burning inside Meghan herself. This is a story of power, pain, legacy, and one woman's refusal to let scandal steal the crown's final breath. The only question now is, what was said in those final minutes, and who made sure Meghan Markle never heard it? Because if William's recent revelation is true, then everything we thought we knew about the Queen's passing may have been a carefully crafted illusion. And what comes next will shock even the most loyal royal watchers. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What really happened inside the Queen's private quarters during her final hours? The cameras were outside the Balmoral gates. The public stood in stunned silence. But inside, a storm was brewing. One filled with whispers, racing footsteps, hushed orders, and a name that kept coming up behind closed doors: Meghan. But before we get there, let's rewind the clock. It was early morning, September 8th, 2022. The air in Scotland was crisp, the skies overcast. Balmoral Castle, normally serene, was tense. Staff had been briefed to maintain strict discretion. Phones were confiscated. Access was restricted. The Queen, Britain's longest-reigning monarch, was dying, and only a chosen few would be allowed near her. Inside her private apartments, Elizabeth II lay in her favorite room, where the sunlight filtered through tall windows she adored. A framed photo of Prince Philip sat nearby, along with her rosary and a well-worn leather-bound prayer book. Nurses came and went in silence. The Queen wasn't just ill. She was fading, and she knew it. According to one insider who later spoke under condition of anonymity, the Queen's last few days had been eerily calm, as if she had made peace with everything. But that peace was not mirrored in the halls outside her room. Because word had gone out, the Queen was not expected to survive the day. Phones lit up across Europe. In Windsor, in Kensington, in Clarence House. The call reached Prince Charles, still the Prince of Wales at the time, just after 7:30 a.m. He was already in Scotland and immediately headed to Balmoral. Camilla followed closely behind. Princess and was already on site, having arrived the night before. It would be later revealed that she was one of the few who stayed by the Queen's side until the very end. Then came the scramble. Prince William, Prince Andrew, Prince Edward. They were all contacted within the hour. But there was a problem. Not everyone could get there in time. The Queen's condition was declining faster than expected. And Harry? He was in London, engaged in what was supposed to be a short visit from the United States alongside Meghan Markle. That's when the chaos really began. According to multiple royal correspondents, Harry and Meghan had originally intended to travel to Balmoral together. Harry reportedly wanted to make the journey with his wife by his side, not just as emotional support, but because, in his mind, she was family. Regardless of royal politics, Meghan was the Queen's granddaughter-in-law. But as news of the Queen's deterioration became public, the palace made a stunning move. The Sussexes were informed that only immediate family should come. Translation: Meghan was not welcome. Here's where things get complicated. While official palace statements have remained vague to this day, carefully tiptoeing around the decision, it was made clear that Meghan was not part of the group traveling to Balmoral. A private jet was arranged. On board, Prince William, Prince Andrew, Prince Edward, and Edward's wife, Sophie. Not Harry, and not Meghan. Harry was forced to find his own way there, boarding a separate flight, alone. Meghan remained in London. But was that her choice? That's where the contradictions start. Some palace insiders claim Meghan was strongly advised to stay behind for practical reasons. The Queen's residence was full. There would be no room. The tone was diplomatic. But others suggest the decision was strategic. One source close to the royal household stated bluntly, it wasn't about logistics. It was about optics. The Queen wanted calm. Meghan brought chaos. Another claimed that William expressed concern about Meghan being there, not because of personal dislike, but because the Queen's final moments were not the time for unresolved tension or public distractions. And Charles? Well, depending on who you believe, he either agreed wholeheartedly or reluctantly went along with it. But here's the twist. While all this maneuvering was happening, the Queen was still alive, still breathing, still capable, reportedly, of whispering a few final thoughts. And yet, Harry and Meghan were nowhere near her. Imagine that. A grandson, rushing to say goodbye. A wife, blocked from the door. A dying monarch, surrounded by a curated circle of royals, and none of them were the Duke and Duchess of Sussex. Meanwhile, at Balmoral, the Queen's energy was dwindling. Doctors had advised family members to prepare for the worst. And still, no official statement had been released to the public. The world didn't yet know that Queen Elizabeth II, the only monarch most living Britons had ever known, was slipping away. Inside the castle, things were unusually quiet. Royal aides moved like ghosts, delivering water, adjusting curtains, tending to the Queen's comfort. Princess Anne, stoic and loyal, stayed at her mother's side. So did Charles, who was already being briefed by advisors about what would happen in the hours after her passing. Protocols were being activated. Operation London Bridge was underway, the meticulously choreographed plan for the Queen's death. But amid all this planning, a much more intimate drama was playing out. Harry was en route, but he would arrive too late. Reports later revealed that by the time Harry's plane touched down in Scotland, the Queen had already died. He had missed her last breath. And Meghan? She never left London at all. Here's the most haunting part. One royal aide claimed that in the Queen's final moments, she asked only to be left in peace. She wanted no press, no commotion, and no conflict. To her, that meant limiting visitors, keeping the room sacred. The aide said she didn't want tension. She didn't want faces she associated with conflict. She wanted her last moments to be serene, focused on family and country, not headlines. That quote, if true, could be the single most devastating insight into the Queen's state of mind at the end. Because if Meghan represented drama, if her very presence threatened to shift the attention from the sovereign to the scandal, then perhaps, in those final hours, Queen Elizabeth II made the hardest decision of all. She chose the monarchy over reconciliation. But here's the tragedy. The fallout of that choice would ripple for months. Harry was reportedly crushed that he didn't get a chance to say goodbye properly. Meghan, though silent in public, was rumored to be deeply hurt by the ban. And the family? Fractured further. To this day, no one in the royal family has publicly explained who made the final call to exclude Meghan from Balmoral. But one thing is clear. That choice was deliberate, planned. calculated. And it marked the start of a new chapter, not just in the monarchy, but in the ongoing war within the Windsor family. Because from the moment the Queen passed, from the moment that breath left her body in the quiet of Balmoral, the stage was set for a kingdom in transition, for secrets to be buried, and for others, long kept hidden, to begin rising to the surface, including one truth so sensitive, even palace aides still refused to speak of it. But William would, eventually. And what he revealed would unravel everything we thought we knew about that day. Because it turns out, the Queen's deathbed had more witnesses than just her family, and one of them heard something that could tear the palace wide open. Why now? Why would Prince William, the stoic heir, the picture of restraint, the man who rarely lets emotion leak into public view, suddenly speak about that day at Balmoral, that unspoken fracture, that silent decision to bar Meghan Markle from the Queen's deathbed? Was it guilt? Pressure? Or was it the weight of the crown, the crushing knowledge that one day, his deathbed might face the same storm? Let's rewind again. This time, not to the Queen's final hours, but to a quieter evening months later. A private dinner in Norfolk. A close friend. A glass of whiskey. No aides, no advisors. Just one future king, and a moment of unfiltered truth. The source? A trusted former military comrade of William's, speaking only on the condition of anonymity. Here's what he said. We weren't even talking about the Queen at first. We were talking about legacy, about how he's preparing George for the future. Then out of nowhere, William goes quiet, looks at the fireplace, and says, I still think about that day. The decision. I wonder if she forgave me. Forgave him? For what? The friend asked. And that's when William allegedly dropped the words that would send shockwaves through royal watchers and insiders alike. We made the call. To keep her away. She wanted peace, not chaos. I had to protect that. It was what Granny would have wanted. Simple, clear, brutal. We made the call. For a man like William, raised in the steel cocoon of royal protocol, taught to endure, deflect, and never explain, those words were like dynamite. Because in that one confession, he confirmed what had only been speculated in whispers, that Meghan's exclusion from Balmoral was not some logistical inconvenience. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a fluke of timing. It was a decision, deliberate, collective, and led, in part, by him. But let's back up. Because the journey to that decision wasn't instant. In the hours after the Queen's decline became apparent, William, second in line, son of the incoming king, was pulled into dozens of calls and meetings. The senior royals were coordinating arrival times, handling press embargoes, deciding who would travel together. And amidst all this, came the question, what about Harry and Meghan? William, according to palace aides, was initially quiet. He knew the risks. He knew the optics. Barring Meghan would create another media firestorm, one the family didn't need in its hour of grief. But then something tipped. One insider, present during one of those frantic coordination calls, later recounted. William just said, she can't come. Not for this. This is about Granny. This is about the crown. Those words became a kind of mantra over the next few hours. This is about the crown. For William, the Queen's death wasn't just a personal loss. It was the start of his own transition. He would now become the Prince of Wales. Next in line, the face of continuity. Every detail mattered. Every gesture, photo, headline, leak. And Meghan? To William, she was unpredictable, emotional, potentially divisive. He reportedly feared that her presence could become the focal point of an already delicate moment. Imagine it. The Queen dies. The nation weeps. And the headlines? Meghan rushed to Balmoral. Harry and Meghan at Queen's deathbed. Royal reconciliation in Queen's final moments. To some, those would have been heartwarming. To William, they were catastrophic. Because he understood one thing better than anyone else in that room. Optics can overshadow legacy. And the Queen's final moments, he believed, should not be about scandal or reconciliation or family drama. They should be about duty. So the conversation happened. Not just with Charles, but with Anne, with Camilla, with senior staff. The idea was floated, debated, quietly confirmed, and then delivered. Harry was told he could come. Alone. Meghan was advised to stay behind. At the time, no official statement was made. The palace remained silent. The press was left to speculate. But inside those halls, a silent agreement had been reached, one that William would later admit still haunted him. Because here's the part most people don't know. When William arrived at Balmoral, the Queen was still alive. Barely. He saw her, spoke to her, held her hand, and according to that same former friend, he whispered something no one else heard. "It's done. She won't come. You have peace." Those words, William believed, brought the Queen comfort. Because throughout her reign, Elizabeth II had always placed the institution above the individual. Family pain came second to public stability. And in her final breath, William wanted to give her that one gift: stillness, quiet, control. But did he wonder, even in that moment, whether Meghan deserved to be there? Whether denying Harry the chance to have his wife at his side was a bridge too far? Yes, and that's what he confessed at that dinner, months later. "I still think about that day. The decision. I wonder if she forgave me." Now pause and think about that. A future king. A man raised to bury emotion. Admitting doubt. Guilt. It wasn't just about Meghan. It was about the price of leadership. About choosing legacy over love. Image over intimacy. The crown over compassion. And for William, who had lost his mother so publicly, so violently, without a chance to say goodbye, the idea of making someone else feel excluded in a moment of death, it stung. But he believed it was necessary. He believed the Queen would have wanted it that way. So he carried the burden, silently, until that one night, with that one friend, when the weight cracked just slightly. And here's where it gets even more interesting. That friend, he didn't keep William's words to himself. Eventually, he shared them with a trusted member of the press. Quietly, off the record, a whisper of a whisper, a test balloon, and it landed. Over the next few weeks, royal gossip columns began dropping hints. William reportedly made key decisions during Queen's final hours. Sources suggest senior royals wanted to maintain peace during vigil. Difficult choices made to honor Her Majesty's legacy. Each article was like a breadcrumb, a slow reveal, until finally, a major paper broke the line wide open. William believed excluding Meghan was Queen's final wish, claims insider. And just like that, the world turned. Debates raged. Was William right? Was Meghan wronged? Did the Queen really request solitude? Or was her silence used as a shield? Meghan's camp remained quiet. Harry didn't respond. But the tension was undeniable. And here's the final twist. That same friend who broke the story claims William knew it would leak. He wanted it to, not as a confession, but as a justification. A way to frame the narrative before it spiraled. To say, we did what we thought was right. It hurt, but it was for her. For the Queen. Only one question remains. What if the Queen never asked for Meghan to stay away? What if, in her final moments, she said nothing at all? Then the decision wasn't fulfilling her wish. It was rewriting it. And that, more than anything, may be what still haunts William. Because if she didn't forgive him, then what does that say about the future king's first true test of leadership? But what if there's more? What if a letter exists? A private message from the Queen to William. One that could either vindicate his choice or expose a devastating betrayal. And that letter may not be lost. In fact, it may still be locked inside the red box on Charles's desk. Unopened, unread, and more dangerous than anyone dares admit. How does a son make a decision on behalf of his mother on the very day she is dying? And what happens when that decision reshapes a monarchy, fractures a family, and triggers a storm the palace will spend years trying to contain? This wasn't just any decision. This was King Charles's first command. And it wasn't about regalia or protocols or even his mother's funeral. It was about who would be allowed into the Queen's deathbed and who wouldn't. The story, as it's been told publicly, is clean, sanitized, safe. Harry traveled to Balmoral alone. Meghan, for logistical reasons, stayed behind. No one wanted to rock the boat in the public eye during a time of national mourning. But behind the palace curtains, the truth was far messier, far more personal, and far more devastating. Because the decision to bar Meghan Markle from the Queen's deathbed was not just approved by Charles. It originated with him. Let's go back to the morning of September 8, 2022. Charles was already in Scotland, staying at Birkhall, his nearby estate. He had been alerted earlier than most about his mother's failing condition, not just as her son, but as her successor. Preparations were already underway for Operation London Bridge. Advisors were briefing him every hour. But in the middle of this cold, clinical machinery of transition, a deeply human decision had to be made. Who would be allowed into the room? At first, the list was short and obvious, and already there. William, en route. Edward and Sophie, both long trusted. Andrew, included by blood but avoided by proximity. Then came the question that froze the room. What about Harry and Meghan? The room paused. Charles, according to palace insiders, hesitated. He wasn't just thinking as a father. He was thinking as king. Let's be honest. Charles had endured more from Harry and Meghan than perhaps any monarch in waiting ever has. The Oprah interview. The Netflix series. The memoir that was already being finalized at the time. Spare. All of it hung in the air like a fog. And yet, Charles was still a father. Still grieving. Still preparing to lose the woman who had shaped every second of his public life. So the idea of Meghan, the woman seen by many inside the palace as the catalyst of the Sussex fallout, being present at the Queen's death, to Charles, that was not just awkward. It was unacceptable. A close aide later described the moment with chilling clarity. He looked down at the papers in front of him, said nothing for a full minute, then looked up and said, "Not now. Not here. This isn't about them." And just like that, the door was closed. Not with anger, not even with malice, but with a chilling finality. The Queen had not yet passed, but Charles had already taken charge, not as a grieving son, as a sovereign in waiting. Now, officially, the palace would say that Meghan didn't accompany Harry due to logistics, that the journey to Balmoral was complicated, that only working royals were to be present. But that's where the cracks begin to show, because Camilla was there. Sophie Wessex was there. Even Andrew, disgraced, exiled, a walking scandal, was permitted to join. So why not Meghan? Why was she the exception? According to another insider, this time, someone close to Clarence's house, Charles believed Meghan's presence would derail the moment. He reportedly said, "This is the end of an era. We cannot let this become another Netflix episode." That line, in particular, stunned those in the room. Charles, ever the image of diplomacy, had finally snapped. The tension with Harry and Meghan had clearly reached a breaking point, and it boiled over at the worst possible time, the Queen's final hours. But here's where it gets more controversial. According to the same source, the Queen had not explicitly forbidden Meghan's presence. She hadn't named her. She hadn't banned her. There was no written instruction. And yet, Charles acted as if there was. He framed it as respecting the Queen's need for calm, her desire for quiet dignity. But some began to whisper, was that truly her wish, or his projection of it? Because if the Queen didn't directly exclude Meghan, then Charles's command becomes something else entirely. It becomes a choice. His choice. One rooted in pain, fear, and perhaps even spite. Let's not forget, just months earlier, Harry had thrown the entire institution into disarray with the Oprah interview. Meghan had publicly accused unnamed royals of racism. She claimed the firm had silenced her, ignored her mental health, even alleged that Archie had been denied a title because of his skin color. Charles was deeply wounded, not just by the allegations, but by what they did to the monarchy. His legacy, his reputation, and yes, his mother's final year. So when that call came, when the Queen's doctors said time was running out, Charles wasn't just thinking about who should say goodbye. He was thinking about how history would remember this moment. Who would be photographed walking into Balmoral? Who would be listed in the official statement as present? Who would be caught on camera, seen weeping, seen hugging, seen in the room? Meghan? In that historic photograph? That Charles could not abide. And so, Harry was called, told to come quickly, told to come alone. There are conflicting accounts of how that conversation went. Some say Charles was calm. Others say he was curt. But one line has since emerged, allegedly heard by an aide outside the room. Tell him she stays. He knows why. Cold. Final. No room for argument. Meghan, by all accounts, was stunned. She reportedly tried to reach Charles directly. No reply. Tried to text William. Silence. Even tried to go through and whom she had once shared a surprisingly cordial rapport with. No response. Harry, caught between fury and duty, had to choose. He chose to go. Alone. But what's haunting is what came next. Charles, later that afternoon, reportedly stood outside the Queen's room, just minutes before going in to say his final goodbye, and whispered to his aide. She would have understood. She never wanted noise. Was he justifying his choice? Reassuring himself? Or rewriting the Queen's wishes to align with his own discomfort? We may never know. What we do know is this. When the Queen took her final breath, Meghan Markle was not present, and Charles had made sure of it. Was it the right decision? Depends who you ask. Some royalists hailed it as a bold act of leadership, a necessary boundary to protect a sacred moment from intrusion. Others saw it as vindictive, petty, proof that even in death, the royal family could not extend basic grace. But here's where it gets even darker. Because according to one longtime royal advisor, there was a second decision Charles made that day. A follow-up, one no one noticed at the time. He ordered that no communication from Meghan be passed to the Queen. That's right. No letters, no messages, no texts, nothing. The Queen, in her final hours, would be shielded from Meghan entirely. We can't confirm if Meghan actually tried to send something. A letter, a recording, a note. But the implication alone is staggering. Because if true, Charles didn't just block Meghan's presence. He blocked her voice. And here's the question the palace hopes no one asks. Was it to protect the Queen, or to silence a moment that could humanize Meghan in the eyes of the public? Because if the Queen had received a letter from Meghan, if she had smiled, if she had responded with grace, that story, that image, would live forever. And maybe, just maybe, Charles didn't want that. Maybe he needed to draw a line in the sand. To show Harry, to show Meghan, to show the world. This is the House of Windsor. You are no longer inside. But what if the Queen found out anyway? What if, in her final moments, she asked for Meghan? What if she wondered why her grandson's wife wasn't at his side, and no one had the courage to tell her the truth? Now imagine the weight of that silence. The burden Charles must now carry. Because even a king must eventually answer to the ghosts of the decisions he made, especially the ones made in the final hours of the woman who shaped his throne. And there may be proof. Buried, sealed, locked inside a letter the Queen wrote to Charles 3 days before her passing. A letter labeled only, to be opened at the appropriate time. So the only question left is, what did the Queen write? And did she know what her son was about to do? Because if that letter ever surfaces, the real story of Meghan's exile from Balmoral may finally be revealed. Can a monarch choose her final audience? Can a queen, frail and slipping toward death, still wield enough power to shape her final chapter, even in silence? And if so, did Queen Elizabeth II deliberately orchestrate her deathbed to reflect the values she held closest? Duty, dignity, the crown, not gossip, not scandal, not family feuds splashed across headlines. Because as shocking as it sounds, those closest to the late Queen insist she did not want Meghan there. Not because of hatred, not even necessarily because of bitterness, but because the Queen, right until the very end, believed one thing above all else. There are moments when the monarchy must rise above the noise, and her own death was one of them. Let's go back to those last few days. According to royal insiders who have since come forward, quietly, often off the record, the Queen was more alert than the public ever knew during her final week. She wasn't bedridden the entire time. She wasn't comatose. In fact, one aide described her as being mentally sharp, but physically shrinking. She was fading, yes, but not gone. And more importantly, she knew. She knew this was it. She had been briefed by doctors. And, in her typical pragmatic style, she didn't fear it. She planned for it. She accepted it. And, according to a trusted royal dresser who had served Her Majesty for over 20 years, the Queen gave a quiet, almost whispered instruction to her staff just 2 days before she passed. No fuss. No cameras. No spectacle. Let this be about duty, not distraction. Simple. Almost chillingly calm. But beneath that request was something far deeper. The Queen, even as her body was failing, understood the stakes. This wasn't just a family goodbye. It was a state transition. The final handoff from her reign to Charles's. And in her mind, it needed to be flawless. No tension, no theatrics, no sideshows, and certainly, no opportunity for the media to hijack her passing and make it about them. And let's not pretend she didn't know who them meant. The Sussexes. More specifically, Meghan. Because here's the hard truth few want to say out loud. The Queen loved Harry. Truly. But she did not trust Meghan. That's not speculation. That's not tabloid fluff. That comes from people who worked beside the Queen daily, who watched her react to every interview, every leak, every PR stunt. She didn't rage. She didn't rant. She recoiled. According to a former equerry, after Meghan's Oprah interview aired in 2021, the Queen watched the full special alone in her private drawing room at Windsor. No aides. No Charles. No Camilla. Just her. A pot of Earl Grey. And silence. When it ended, she reportedly stood up, walked over to a window, and said, "This is not how family behaves. Not in public. Not when the crown is at stake." She didn't elaborate. She didn't issue a statement. But her disapproval was clear, and it never truly faded. So by the time September 2022 arrived, and the Queen's health was slipping beyond repair, the idea of Meghan showing up at Balmoral was unthinkable. Not because of vengeance, but because of principle. One insider put it like this: Her Majesty believed that certain events, coronations, funerals, deathbeds, should be sacred, outside the reach of spin. She feared that if Meghan were there, the story would become hers. The Queen didn't hate Meghan, but she didn't want her there. And yes, that belief may have shaped the decision that followed. Charles's order, William's agreement, the palace-wide coordination to ensure Meghan stayed behind. All of it, insiders say, rooted in the Queen's quiet guidance. And yet, she never said Meghan's name. Not directly. That's what makes this even more fascinating. The Queen, in her masterful way, was known for issuing soft power orders. A raised eyebrow, a pause, a redirected question. In this case, it may have been as subtle as this. Let's keep this simple. The closer circle. For family. To her, that meant something different than to the average person. To her, family didn't mean everyone with a bloodline or a ring. It meant those who had stood by her, who had served the institution, who had kept the crown above themselves. And Meghan had not. That doesn't make her evil, but it made her, in the Queen's eyes, not fit for this moment. And the palace responded accordingly. But here's where it gets more complex. Despite what was decided around her, the Queen was reportedly aware that the choice would spark backlash, that Meghan's absence would be noticed, criticized, spun, and yet, she didn't reverse it. She didn't make a dying decree. She didn't whisper, "Bring her." She said nothing, and that silence was everything. Because in royal circles, what the Queen doesn't say is often more powerful than what she does. A former lady-in-waiting revealed this damning quote. She understood the chaos of the modern media. She knew Meghan's presence would overshadow the crown. And she chose, even then, to protect the institution over the headlines. But let's look deeper. Did the Queen ever privately forgive Meghan? Was there a moment of reconciliation before the end? Some say yes, that the Queen wrote personal letters to several family members during her final week. That one such letter was for Harry. Not Charles, not William, just Harry. And in that letter, sources believe she expressed love, but also disappointment. No rage, no bitterness, just sadness that he had drifted so far, that he had allowed the palace walls to collapse around him, that she wouldn't live to see that bridge rebuilt. But Meghan? If a letter was written for her, no one has confirmed it. Some claim it never existed. Others believe it may have been intercepted, discarded, forgotten, but the result was the same. Meghan never made it to Balmoral, and according to one chilling quote from a senior royal aide, she never would have. Because the Queen, even on her deathbed, chose control. She chose order, legacy, continuity. The monarchy, to her, was more than just family. It was her life's work, and she wasn't about to let its final moment be reduced to another tabloid circus. So the decision was made. No press, no pageantry, no Meghan. And in her last act as Queen, Elizabeth II did what she had done for 70 years. She put the crown above everything, even family, even love, even forgiveness. That's not cruelty. That's not coldness. That's monarchy. That's duty. And that was her will. But one question still lingers, hidden in the corners of royal corridors. Did Harry ask her? In those final hours, when he finally made it to Balmoral, too late to say goodbye, did he ask the question that had haunted him for hours? Did she want Meghan here? And if he did, who answered? Charles? William? A trembling aide? Or silence? Because silence, in this family, says everything. And Harry's face the next morning, stone, red-eyed, hollow, suggested he had heard the answer. And it broke him. But what came next would break something even bigger. Because Meghan, blindsided, hurt, furious, wasn't going to stay silent forever. She had questions too. And soon, she would start demanding answers. On record. On camera. And the war that the Queen tried to silence? It would explode the moment her voice went quiet. What does it feel like to be told, without warning, without ceremony, that you are not welcome at the deathbed of the most powerful woman in the world? That's the question Meghan Markle faced on the morning of September 8, 2022. The headlines hadn't broken yet. The cameras hadn't turned. But behind closed doors at Frogmore Cottage, Harry had just hung up a call. His face pale. His jaw clenched. His shoulders rigid. He turned to Meghan and reportedly said one thing. "I have to go. Alone." In that moment, the air changed. Time slowed. And Meghan's entire world, already cracked by tension with the royal family, shattered. Because no matter what titles had been stripped, no matter how many interviews she'd given, or how far she and Harry had flown from the firm's grip, Meghan believed one thing. She was still family, and family should be there at the end. Especially for a woman who had once welcomed her into the fold with grace, a warm smile, and a pearl and diamond brooch. The very first gift Queen Elizabeth II gave her during their only solo engagement. But now she was being shut out. With no official explanation, no softening of the blow, no comfort from the palace. Just a firm, "You are not to come." And it cut deep. According to a source close to Meghan, someone in her California circle, not the British press machine. Meghan's initial reaction was not anger. It was tears. Pure, stunned grief. She asked Harry again and again, "Are you sure? Is this what she wanted? Are you sure it's not them?" But Harry couldn't answer. He didn't know. Because even he, the Queen's beloved grandson, hadn't spoken to her directly. The message had come through aides. Through Charles. Through William, perhaps. But not from the Queen herself. And that silence left Meghan in limbo. In a strange, ironic twist, the woman accused for years of hijacking the royal spotlight was now forcibly pushed into the shadows. Invisible. Erased from the moment history was about to record. So what did she do? What does any person do when the door is slammed in their face? She tried to speak through it. According to at least two people close to her, Meghan quickly drafted a private message, a short note intended for the Queen. It wasn't long. It wasn't dramatic. But it was deeply personal. A few words of love, of thanks, of sorrow, and perhaps, if whispers are to be believed, an apology. But the message never arrived. Because here's where the tragedy deepens. The letter was reportedly handed to a trusted aide, someone Meghan believed might help slip it through the back channels to Balmoral. But whether it was intercepted, dismissed, or simply lost in the chaos of transition, it was never delivered. One source later said, "It was as if every line of communication had been shut down. Completely. Deliberately." That same source added something even more unsettling. There was a moment, a brief window, when the message could have reached her, before the Queen slipped out of lucidity. But by the time it was read by anyone at Balmoral, it was too late. And so the last chance for Meghan Markle to express anything, gratitude, closure, grace, was lost forever. But let's pause for a second. Can you imagine the silence that must have followed? Alone in Frogmore Cottage, the house they'd fought to keep, the house that had become more prison than home. Meghan sat in stillness, waiting, wondering, watching the clock. And hours later, like the rest of the world, she learned the truth from a headline. The Queen was gone, and Meghan, still unheard, still uninvited. To this day, no one has ever confirmed whether the Queen knew Meghan had written that message. Some believe Charles ordered that no external communications be passed to the Queen in her final hours, not even from Harry's wife. Others suggest the Queen may have heard a condensed version of it, passed through a whisper from Harry himself when he finally arrived at Balmoral. But there's no proof, only shadows. And that's what made Meghan's grief so complex. She wasn't just mourning a monarch. She was mourning the loss of redemption, of reconciliation, of being seen, even for a moment, as something other than a threat. According to a former Netflix colleague who spoke off-record, Meghan was visibly shaken in the days following the Queen's death. Not just out of sadness, but out of frustration. Because immediately, the narrative began spinning without her. The press seized the imagery, Harry arriving alone, Meghan staying behind. The implication was loud and clear. She wasn't wanted. And that, to Meghan, was a knife in the chest. Not only had she been barred from Balmoral, she had been cast as the villain in her absence. And this is where anger began to replace sorrow. According to sources, Meghan began asking sharp questions in the days following. Who made the call? Did William push for this? Why was Camilla allowed in and I wasn't? Why did Harry not fight harder? Even her trust in Harry reportedly wavered. Not because she believed he agreed with the ban, but because he didn't stop it, because he didn't demand her presence. And because when the moment came, he left. Alone. According to one friend, Meghan reportedly said, "He left me behind, just like they all did." Let that sink in. The woman who challenged a monarchy, who stood on stages around the world demanding compassion and inclusion, was excluded from the most intimate, human moment in the royal family's modern history. No cameras, no court, no coronation, just a quiet goodbye, and she wasn't allowed in. But Meghan is nothing if not strategic. She didn't lash out publicly. Not then. She didn't issue a statement. She didn't sit for an interview. But those close to her say she was watching closely, tracking every headline, every snub, every photograph. And she was preparing, because this wasn't over. Not for her. The narrative had been twisted. And one day, she would tell her version. Unfiltered, uncut. The world had seen her cry before. But this was different. This time, she cried in silence. Not because of trolls, tabloids, or royal protocol, but because the one woman who might have offered her a thread of grace in the end never got her message. And if you believe the rumors, Meghan kept that note. Folded, unsent, in a drawer, unread, a relic of what might have been, a last act of dignity denied, a moment the Queen never received, or perhaps chose to ignore. Because what if, and this is the real twist, the Queen knew? What if the aides did deliver the message? What if she read it and chose not to respond, chose silence, not out of cruelty, but out of finality, a monarch's last act of control, to leave a door closed permanently? Because not all stories end with forgiveness, not all wounds are healed, and not all messages arrive in time. But what if someone else saw it? What if that note, Meghan's last words to the Queen, was read by someone else in the palace? And what they did with it would change everything. In every family, there are secrets. In the royal family, there are wars, and the battlefield is silence. But sometimes, that silence fractures. Cracks appear. Glances turn into whispers. Whispers into confrontations. And soon, beneath the surface of controlled public grief, the Windsor family was splintering. Because not everyone agreed with Charles's decision. Not everyone thought Meghan should have been shut out. And what came next was not a unified show of royal strength. It was a quiet mutiny. Let's begin with what the cameras didn't catch. The morning after the Queen's death, Balmoral was cloaked in mourning. But inside, the atmosphere was tense. Charles, now officially king, was already issuing commands. Operation London Bridge was in full swing. Advisors rushed between rooms. Black suits appeared. Flags lowered. But behind closed doors, a different conversation was erupting. And the tension? It started with Princess Anne. Yes, the famously stoic, duty-bound Princess Royal. The woman many had always assumed would fall in line with protocol, no matter the cost. But not this time. A palace staffer, speaking on condition of anonymity, described the scene. She waited until Charles was alone. Then she came in, shut the door, and said, "I hope you know what you've done." That wasn't an idle comment, and had been at the Queen's side. Not just in the final hours, but for days beforehand. She had heard the Queen's words, watched her expressions, felt her breath weaken, and according to this source, and believed the Queen had never intended for Meghan to be so publicly excluded. In fact, the source claims that and told Charles, "You've made it look like Mother died angry." That wasn't her heart. Boom. That was the crack. And it didn't stop with Anne. Because not long after, another figure stepped into the fray, Sophie Wessex, the Countess of Wessex, Edward's wife. Soft-spoken, warm, often described as the Queen's second daughter. But in this moment, Sophie was reportedly furious. Not about the decision itself, but about how it was handled. A former footman recalled overhearing her speak to Edward later that night. They could have said it kindly. They could have let her send a message, at the very least. It was too harsh, too cold, and it's going to haunt us. But Charles wasn't backing down. He believed, firmly, that he had acted out of loyalty to the Queen's values. that by preserving stillness at Balmoral, he had preserved the monarchy's image. And William? He supported it, outwardly. But behind the scenes, even he was beginning to waver. One trusted advisor recounted a chilling moment between Charles and William just before they left Balmoral for London. Charles, steeling himself for the cameras, asked, "You still think we did the right thing?" To which William, exhausted, pale, conflicted, simply said, "I think it was the least wrong thing." That's different. That subtle hesitation did not go unnoticed, because even William, who had agreed with Charles in principle, was now beginning to feel the emotional toll. After all, he had seen Harry's face. He had watched him arrive alone, late, devastated, and later, during the walkabout at Windsor, the now famous joint appearance with Harry and Meghan, William had seen something even more haunting. The way the crowd reacted. Some cheered, but others wept. Not for the Queen, for the brothers, for what had been lost, for what had been denied. And for a brief, flickering second, William seemed to feel it. That maybe, just maybe, the public had wanted unity, not division. But back at Balmoral, Charles remained firm. His allies? Fewer than expected. Camilla, of course, supported the decision. According to multiple insiders, she had quietly told Charles. She'd have rolled her eyes at the drama, and you know it. In Camilla's view, the Queen would have seen Meghan's presence as an unnecessary complication, an emotional landmine. But not everyone bought that. Edward, always the quiet one, was reportedly deeply uncomfortable. He didn't confront Charles directly. That wasn't his style. But during a late-night conversation with Anne, he reportedly confessed, "If it had been Louise, if it had been my daughter, I would never forgive them." And simply nodded, because that's the part that cut deepest. Harry was a son, a brother, a grandson, and yet, he was forced to grieve in isolation. Not by distance, by design. And Meghan? Whether you loved her or loathed her, the image was brutal. The only woman excluded. The only one whose presence was blocked. No explanation. No statement. No acknowledgement. And this decision, this internal royal rift, had consequences. Immediately, divisions began to appear. Behind palace walls. Within Kensington. Even among staff. One aide described it like this. It felt like a loyalty test. You were either with Charles and the hardliners, or you were seen as soft, as weak, as emotional. And that's how you lost access, lost influence. Even among the clergy preparing the Queen's memorial services, debates reportedly raged about whether to include indirect references to family unity or avoid the topic entirely. The Archbishop of Canterbury, sources say, wanted to speak about forgiveness, about reconciliation, about the Queen's hope for togetherness. But senior royal aides blocked the language. Why? Because they feared it would spark speculation about Meghan. Again, even in death, she was a live wire. And the family? Fractured down the middle. Anne, Sophie, Edward. They stood quietly on one side. Charles, Camilla, William, increasingly uneasy, on the other. And Harry? He stood alone, isolated, surrounded by formality, crushed by the weight of what had just happened. A private funeral inside his heart. For a grandmother, he could not reach. But the most surprising defector? A figure whose opinion no one expected to matter. Princess Beatrice. Yes, Andrew's daughter. Once known for her hats, her awkward wedding, her shy presence in royal events. But in the days after the Queen's passing, Beatrice reportedly broke with the family line in a private conversation with her mother, Sarah Ferguson. According to a friend, she said, "We preach about modern monarchy, about compassion, and we couldn't find a seat for one more." It was a quiet indictment, a whisper of generational change. Because while Charles was trying to uphold tradition, the younger royals were watching and wondering whether this was truly the monarchy they wanted to inherit. One divided, exclusionary, afraid of emotion, afraid of humanity. And that whisper, from Beatrice to Fergie, did not stop there. Because soon, it reached Eugenie, and then Zara. And before long, several of the Queen's grandchildren were quietly questioning the choice made at the top. No one said it aloud. No one dared put it in writing. But the feeling spread like wildfire. The monarchy had made a mistake. A decision that would leave a scar not just on Harry, but on history. And now, that scar is still visible. Not in speeches, not in photos, but in the looks, the stiffness, the spacing, the The forced smiles. At every event since the Queen's death, eagle-eyed watchers have noticed it. The energy has changed. Unity has become performance. Togetherness has become theater. Because deep down, they all remember what happened at Balmoral. They remember the flight Harry didn't take, the woman left behind, the message never received, and the decision that tore a family apart, just minutes before a nation began to grieve. But one question still remains, one that threatens to reopen the wound. Who truly made the final call, and who tried to stop it? Because a document may exist, a meeting note, an email, a voice memo, and if it ever surfaces, we may learn that someone, perhaps even or Edward, fought harder than anyone knew, and was overruled. Which means the royal family's unity was never as solid as it seemed. It was cracked, divided, and beneath it all, one name still lingers in every corridor. Not the Queen's, Meghan's. Because her absence wasn't just an exclusion. It was a statement, one that some family members accepted, and others will never forgive. What does a monarch say in her final hours? Not to her family, but to the people who've been beside her through it all. Not the heirs, not the courtiers, but the aides. The ones who buttoned her coats, arranged her handbags, scheduled her walks, and guarded her privacy like a fortress. The ones who saw her not as a crown, but as a woman. Queen Elizabeth II didn't die alone. She didn't just pass in the arms of princes. She left this world with whispers. And some of those whispers, long buried behind protocol and palace silence, are only now beginning to surface. Let's go inside, behind the curtains of Balmoral. Behind the stiff public statements and rehearsed tears. Back to those final, intimate hours when the Queen, pale, weary, but still lucid, was speaking. And those listening weren't royals. They were her people. Let's begin with Angela Kelly. For 2 decades, Kelly was the Queen's right hand. Her personal dresser, her confidant, her informal gatekeeper. More than a servant, less than a friend. Something unique only the Queen could define. In Angela's own memoir, she once wrote that she and the Queen laughed until we cried and shared more than anyone will ever know. That bond remained until the very end. Kelly was one of the few allowed constant access during the Queen's final days. And according to one insider who remained close to Balmoral's staff, the Queen's final words to Angela were not about fashion or legacy. They were about balance, about calm. The Queen reportedly said, "It's been loud, hasn't it? Too loud. I don't want it to end in noise." Angela didn't ask what she meant. She didn't have to. The Queen wasn't talking about the weather. She was talking about the Sussexes, about the media circus, the headlines, the tension that had ripped through her family like a steel wire pulled tight for too long. That quote, "too loud, I don't want it to end in noise," was later echoed in a private staff memo allegedly circulated to Balmoral personnel. Its instruction was clear. Let Her Majesty's passing be serene. Respect her preference for quiet. Avoid chaos. Now, read between the lines. This wasn't just about the atmosphere. This was about control. The Queen, even on her deathbed, was managing her legacy. And her chosen instruments were not Charles or William, but her aides. Angela wasn't the only one. Paul Wybrew, Tall Paul, as he was affectionately known, had served the Queen for over 40 years. He was there the day she met James Bond for the Olympic sketch. He was there during lockdown at Windsor. He was there at the end. One staff member remembers Paul exiting the Queen's room with eyes red but jaw firm, saying, "She asked me if people would understand." That question, simple as it sounds, carries immense weight. Understand what? Her decision? Her silence? Her need to exclude? Or perhaps her fear that she'd be remembered for division, not devotion? Because here's the truth. The Queen knew the Meghan question would define her final chapter. She knew the press would pounce, that critics would call her cold, that others would call her wise. She wasn't asking for absolution. She was wondering if the world would understand why she made the choices she did. And the aides? They knew. Not because she declared it, but because of what she didn't say. According to one unnamed footman, the Queen spent much of her final hours asking after her horses, her dogs, the state of the gardens, but never once asked about Meghan. Not has she called, not is she coming, nothing. And in the royal family, that silence screams. But here's where the mystery deepens. The Queen did mention Harry. Twice. The first time was when she reportedly asked Angela Kelly, Has he landed yet? That was hours before Harry arrived, too late to say goodbye. The second time was more cryptic. According to a source within the kitchen staff, who overheard the Queen's soft voice from just outside her suite, she said, "He still has his mother's heart, but he's been guided elsewhere." A pause, then silence. Who was she referring to? Meghan? Or someone else? Was it sadness? Disappointment? Or simply acceptance? No one knows. But that single sentence, "he still has his mother's heart," reveals everything. It tells us the Queen saw Diana's legacy in Harry. The tenderness, the rebellion, the pain. And it tells us she recognized he had strayed. That someone, or something, had pulled him into a different orbit. And she wasn't going to chase him. She was going to leave the door open in silence. But there's one more conversation, perhaps the most important of all, with Canon Kenneth Mackenzie, the minister of Crathy Kirk, the church the Queen attended during her stays at Balmoral. In the final hours, he was summoned, not to give last rites, but to speak, to pray, and perhaps, if reports are to be believed, to record. A private aide claims that during their final meeting, the Queen requested that Kenneth make note of their talk, that she wanted a record, not for the public, but for future guidance. This has sparked intense speculation that the Queen delivered a final message, not just to God, but to her successor. Some believe she gave Charles instructions. Others believe it was about Harry. But one theory, from a senior royal historian, is far more provocative. It may have been about Meghan, about forgiveness, about what she hoped might happen after.